I swear, I'm always doing these videos right before or right after the gym. Put your flexi emoji if you did your reading. Today, we're going to talk about the history of abortion. So, particularly with the rise of Christian nationalism in the U.S., abortion is a hot topic. It's deeply religiously tied. And there's this idea that Christians have always been opposed to abortion, that this is a Christian issue, which is not the case, and the history of abortion may be vastly different than you think. The very early Christian church had wide beliefs on abortion, how long it was permissible, was it a sin? And there was three main schools of thought that came from the main schools of Greek philosophy. The Stoics believe that life begins at breath, so at birth, whenever first breath is taken. And the Bible makes several references to life beginning at first breath. Adam wasn't alive until he was given breath. The Pythagoreans took the belief that life begins at conception, and the followers of Aristotle and Plato believe that life began at ensoulment. When does personhood enter? Consciousness. And they believed that this could not happen until the body was fully formed. So it was believed that personhood began at what was called the quickening, or the age of viability, when the mother would start to feel the fetus move. And the idea of abortion up until the quickening was by far the most held belief up until the mid-1800s. Even Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine held the belief that up until the age of ensoulment, which has to happen after the body is fully formed, it cannot be considered murder up until that time. This was held throughout the Middle Ages, the 15, 16, 1700s. It wasn't until the mid-1800s in the US, it started in 1847 with the founding of the American Medical Association, a group of white male doctors who wanted to dominate the medical field. And one of the things that they did not want to include was women or people of color. Now, up until this point, OB care abortions were performed by midwives, women, house servants, maidservants. So because they were not willing to include women in their practice, they had to find a way to push these women out. So they started labeling them as quacks, abortions as vile and barbaric. They began to write to states saying that the medical consensus was that life begins at conception and that these practices should not be permitted and that these women should not be allowed to practice. And between 1860 and 1880, 40 anti-abortion laws were passed due to the American Medical Association's desire to control the medical industry just under white men. And it might surprise you to know that during this time, so this 1860 to 1880, it wasn't until 1869 that Pope Pius IV issued an edict to Catholic churches that abortion would no longer be allowed at any time. Up until this point, the Catholic Church held the stance that up until the quickening, it was permissible. A lot of doctors would still perform these, especially if the mother was ill or impoverished. And there was a lot of leniency given in the 1930s during the Great Depression because it was seen as merciful when families couldn't even feed themselves. There were no resources, there were no jobs. And this kind of leniency carried through until after World War II. During World War II, women went to work, they found autonomy, they were making their own money, they were running businesses. It was a whole new world for women in the United States. But when the men came back from war, they had to find a way to force women back in the home. So now doctors are prosecuted for performing abortions. And there is an entire slew of propaganda telling women that the most beautiful life they could have is to be this 1950s housewife. That's where we get this imagery. It was a propaganda campaign because women did not want to be shut in the home anymore. And what we would neglect to kind of acknowledge from that time is how frequent female suicide was, as well as high prescriptions of barbiturates in order to get through the day. Women didn't want to go back in the home, but they were forced to by banning abortions entirely, prosecuting doctors that would allow women to have abortions, and by releasing this propaganda campaign that women belong in the home and this is where you're truly going to be happy. This is also the rise of complementarianism in the church, where women were taught that your highest calling is to have a husband and kids. And it was because of this crackdown post-World War II against abortions that 17% of deaths to pregnant women and infant deaths were attributed to illegal abortions because women could no longer get them. From 1963 to 1965, the dial was kind of pushed back a little bit because of a rubella outbreak. Now, if you're pregnant and you catch rubella, it can cause horrible birth defects. So it was considered, again, a merciful act to allow for an abortion for a woman who had rubella. But again, true to historical form, this was really only permissible for white, privileged women who should not be forced to suffer such a thing, while poor, impoverished women of color were not allowed to get these abortions either. During this time, evangelicals did not take a unified hard stance on abortion. This was considered a Catholic issue, and many popular theologians of the time had varying beliefs on it. In fact, in 1968, Christianity Today, which is like the dominant Christian publication, released an article where 26 of the top theologians kind of debated the issue and gave their viewpoint. Now, what they didn't agree on is whether it's a sin or not. What they did agree on is that there are many instances where it is merciful and prudent to allow it. All 26 of them agreed that it should be allowed. In fact, Carl F. Henry, who was the founder of Christianity Today, said a woman's body is not the property or dominion of others. And his successor, Harold Wenzel, said that mercy and prudence may favor therapeutic abortion. In St. Louis in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention met and they made a resolution legalizing abortion within the church, a decision that they reaffirmed in 1974 after the passing of Roe and again in 1976. The then president of the Baptist Convention said, "I have always felt that it is only after the child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it becomes an individual person. And it has always therefore seemed to me that what is best for the mother and best for the future should be allowed." So why did this change? This is 1976. Why did this change? Within the US, Francis Schaeffer is kind of the birth of the religious right and the anti-abortion movement. But when he asked both Billy Graham and James Dobson to join him, both of them said no, because it was plausible that life does not begin until birth. This is Billy Graham and James Dobson. Y'all remember Focus on the Fucking Family? He turned Schaeffer down. It wasn't until the evangelicals lost the battle against desegregation that all of these opinions began to change, and let me tell you why. When Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, it was no longer legal to have segregation in public spaces, schools, restaurants, including private Christian academies. And the IRS went so far as to say, we are going to remove your tax-exempt status if you continue to segregate and discriminate on the basis of race. Enter Jerry fucking Falwell. So Jerry Falwell called the civil rights movement the civil wrongs. And in response to desegregation in 1967, he opened Liberty Christian Academy, which is attached to Liberty University, as a way for rich Southern white families to send their kids to a school where blacks weren't allowed. By this time, the cultural popular opinion had turned around. People no longer wanted segregation. That wasn't going to mobilize people. So Jerry Falwell and other dominant theologians honed in on the abortion argument. For the first time in American history, this now became a evangelical stance. They couldn't run with racism, so they ran with abortion and said Jerry Falwell didn't preach his first anti-abortion sermon until 1978. And in the midterms of 1978, 4 key races needed to be won. It was New Hampshire, Iowa, and 2 races in Minnesota. Anti-abortion Roman Catholics showed up in leafleted church parking lots, and in a surprisingly low turnout election, they were able to beat the favored Democrats for those Senate seats. 1980, when Ronald Reagan gave his famous speeches in Dallas, he never mentioned abortion as part of his platform at all because it hadn't quite taken hold yet. But it was a really ingenious political sleight of hands. They were able to use abortion as a smokescreen for what they really wanted was, I don't want you to tell me I have to include black people in my religious institutions. And now abortion has become a cornerstone of the alt-right Christian fundamentalist movement. And the reality of it is that the rich and the privileged, and especially the white, will always have access to abortions that they need, while the poor and impoverished will be denied that right. The 14th Amendment states, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law." The 14th Amendment protects the right to our bodies. The state cannot command you to do with your body what you do not want to do. It cannot confiscate your organs from you. And somehow we have forgotten that, even though for about 100 years the Supreme Court has ruled that this does in fact protect bodily autonomy. But I hope that this is insightful. I hope it lets you see that abortion is really just another power issue, the people who want to control other people.